I set my son's retirement gift on the table, and my daughter-in-law picked it up, looked at it for 3 seconds, and said, "Dad, really? This is what you brought?" She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. My son looked away. The people around us went quiet for a moment. Then the party kept going like nothing happened. I didn't say a word. I picked the envelope back up, put it in my jacket pocket, walked out the side door of the restaurant, and handed it to the man sitting on the bench outside, the one who'd been there when I arrived, nursing a paper cup of coffee. I said, "Here, take care of yourself." He looked up at me, surprised. I nodded and walked to my car. I sat there for a while, not crying, not angry, just sitting. 30 minutes later, my phone started ringing. "My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the county, drove the same route to work every morning, and packed my own lunch every day until I retired. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't make scenes. I don't raise my voice. My late wife, Margaret, used to say that I had the patience of a man who'd already seen everything twice. She meant it as a compliment. I raised my son Daniel on my own from the time he was 14. Margaret passed from ovarian cancer that year. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. Daniel was a quiet kid who became a quiet teenager who became a man I am genuinely proud of. He works in logistics management. He's steady, reliable, careful with money, all things I tried to teach him. He met Courtney 6 years ago at a conference in Atlanta. She's 10 years younger than him, sharp, fast-talking, the kind of woman who finishes your sentences and is usually right about where they were going. I tried to like her. I did like her actually in the beginning. She was funny. She remembered details. Asked me follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned months before. I thought she was attentive. What I didn't understand at first was the difference between attentive and calculating. The first time I noticed something was off was about 4 months after Daniel and Courtney got engaged. We were having dinner at their apartment. They'd just moved in together. And I mentioned that I'd been thinking about updating my will. Nothing dramatic. Just that I'd been to my doctor, gotten some numbers back I didn't love, and it made me want to get things in order. Sensible stuff. Courtney looked up from her plate and said very casually, "Oh, what kind of assets are we talking about, Walter?" I remember the exact way she said it. We, like it was already decided. Daniel didn't catch it. Or maybe he did and didn't know what to do with it. Either way, the conversation moved on, and I filed it away. Over the next 2 years, I watched a pattern develop. Courtney was warm to me when she wanted something, when they needed help moving, when the furnace in their house broke and they were short on cash that month, when Daniel's car needed a new transmission and they didn't want to touch their savings. I helped. That's what fathers do. But after each of those moments, there'd be a cooling. A few weeks where texts went unanswered a little longer. Dinners that got rescheduled. A distance that closed only when the next need appeared. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Margaret had always been better at reading people than I was. Without her, I second-guessed my own instincts constantly. But I kept a mental log. Not out of bitterness. I'm not built that way. But because I'm an engineer, I notice patterns. I document things. Daniel got a big promotion last spring. Regional director. He'd been working toward it for 4 years, and when he got it, I was the first person he called. I could hear it in his voice. That specific kind of quiet happiness that comes from achieving something you worked hard for and didn't take shortcuts to get. I was proud of him in a way I don't have language for. Courtney organized a celebration dinner at a steakhouse downtown. 12 people, colleagues of Daniel's, a few of their couple friends, Courtney's sister and her husband, and me. I was seated at the far end of the table, away from Daniel, next to a man I'd never met who spent most of the night on his phone. I didn't say anything about the seating. I ate my dinner. I listened to the toasts. When it came time for gifts, I brought an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000. Money I'd set aside for my retirement fund specifically for this moment. I'd been planning it since he first told me he was gunning for the position. I thought he and Courtney could use it for the down payment on the bigger house they've been talking about, or invest it, or just have it as a cushion. I wasn't attached to what they did with it. I wanted him to have the freedom of options. I handed the envelope to Daniel. He started to open it. Courtney was sitting next to him and leaned over, and she got to it first, pulled out the card, flipped it open, and looked at the check. She set it down on the table, face up. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that tone, the one that sounds like patience but is actually something else entirely. "Really? A check? This is what you brought to a celebration like this?" She picked up the envelope, held it for a second, then set it back down with a small shake of her head. "We were expecting something a little more, I don't know, thoughtful." The table went quiet. Daniel's colleague directly across from me looked down at his plate. Someone cleared their throat. Courtney's sister stared at the centerpiece. Daniel said quietly, "Courtney." She waved her hand. "No, it's fine. It's fine, Walter. It's the thought that counts, right?" And she smiled at me. That specific smile that dares you to react. I didn't react. I looked at my son. He was staring at the tablecloth. He didn't say anything else. I reached over, picked up the envelope, folded it once, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I said, "Excuse me for a moment." I walked to the exit, nodded at the hostess, and pushed through the front door into the evening air. There was a man sitting on the wooden bench outside the restaurant. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, roughly my age, actually, though life had treated him differently. He had a paper cup from the diner down the block and a duffel bag at his feet. He looked up when I came out the way people do when they're bracing to be told to move along. I pulled the envelope out of my jacket. He watched me. I said, "There's a cashier's check in here for $15,000. It's made out to my son, but I want you to have it. You can take it to any bank. Tell them the situation. Ask to speak to a manager. They'll help you get it sorted." He stared at me. "Sir, I can't." "I know it sounds strange," I said, "but I'd rather you have it than leave it on that table." He took it slowly, like he was waiting for a punchline. I went back inside, returned to my seat, and finished my coffee. I didn't look at Courtney. I talked to the colleague next to me about golf, a sport neither of us particularly cared about but that filled 12 minutes without incident. When the dinner ended, I said goodbye to Daniel. He hugged me and started to say something, and I told him we'd talk later. It was fine, and I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the night she was first diagnosed, how we sat in the hospital parking garage for 40 minutes before we could bring ourselves to drive home, just holding hands in the front seat. She had squeezed my hand at some point and said, "Whatever happens, we don't fall apart." I had kept that promise for her. I had not fallen apart. I was not going to fall apart over a check and a dinner table. My phone buzzed, then rang. Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. I picked up the second time. "Dad." His voice was different than it had been at dinner. Quieter, strained. "Dad, we have a situation." I said, "What kind of situation?" He paused. "The man you gave the envelope to, he came back inside." His name, it turned out, was Gerald. Gerald had been sitting on that bench outside the restaurant for 2 hours, having nowhere particular to be that night. He'd been staying at the shelter on Moorfield a few weeks, lost his apartment after a workplace injury took him off the job for 8 months. He was not, as he put it to Daniel and Courtney inside the restaurant, a man who took things that weren't meant for him. He had come back inside, asked the hostess to point him toward the party that had just been seated in the back room, walked over to the table, and placed the envelope in front of Courtney. He'd said, and Daniel relayed this to me word for word because 2 of the guests at the table had apparently already texted their own version of events to mutual friends. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. The gentleman who gave this to me seemed like he was doing it out of hurt, not out of generosity. I don't think I should be the one to keep it." Courtney had stared at him. He'd looked around the table, nodded politely, and walked back out. The table had gone completely silent. Daniel told me all of this standing in my driveway 20 minutes after I'd gotten home. He'd driven straight there. He sat in the passenger seat of his car with the door open and his feet on the asphalt, and I sat on my front step, and we talked in the dark. I didn't perform anything. I didn't make him feel worse than he already did, but I also didn't let him minimize it, which he tried to do once. Started to say that Courtney sometimes spoke before she thought, that she hadn't meant it the way it came out. I said, "Daniel, she meant it exactly the way it came out. The question isn't what she meant. The question is why you didn't say anything." He was quiet for a long time. A car went by on the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. He said, "I didn't know what to say." I said, "I know. That's the thing I want you to think about. I wasn't angry at my son. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to read this as a story about a father who felt betrayed by his child. It wasn't that. Daniel is a good man, but good men can learn to look away from things, slowly, over time, without realizing they're doing it. Margaret and I had raised him better than that. Not better than to make mistakes, but better than to make peace with them. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. He asked about the check. I told him to keep it. The check was made out to him, not to Courtney, not to them as a couple, to him. And I wanted him to have it, regardless of everything else. I said I hadn't given it to Gerald to make a point or to cause a scene. I'd given it away because in that moment, sitting at that table after what she'd said, I couldn't stand the idea of it landing where it was meant to land and being absorbed without any acknowledgement of what had just happened. Gerald had given it back anyway, which told me something about Gerald. Daniel asked if I'd want to meet him. I said I didn't think that was appropriate. He went home. I went inside. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the lights low the way I'd done on hard nights since Margaret died. And I thought about what I needed to do next. I am not a man who makes sudden decisions. I think in systems. I look at inputs and outputs. I consider long-term structural integrity. Over the following week, I did several things quietly. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia who'd handled Margaret's estate and who I'd worked with periodically since, and I told her I wanted to review and update my will. We went through it carefully. I made changes that reflected my current situation and my current wishes. I was not vindictive about it. I was accurate. I also called my financial advisor and restructured the beneficiary designations on 2 of my accounts. Again, not out of anger, out of clarity. I had been operating on assumptions that no longer matched reality. A good engineer doesn't leave structural decisions based on outdated assessments. I didn't tell Daniel I'd done any of this, not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't about him. These were my finances, my decisions, my life. He would find out what he needed to find out when it mattered. I also, around this time, thought more about Gerald. I'd asked Daniel what had happened to him after he returned the envelope. Daniel said he'd simply walked out. No one had gone after him. No one had offered him anything. He'd handed back $15,000 and walked back out into the night, and the table had moved on. That bothered me, not in a sentimental way. I don't romanticize struggle, but something about it sat wrong. A man in a difficult position had done an honest thing at some personal cost. Probably some part of him had spent those 20 minutes inside the restaurant turning the money over in his mind, and he'd chosen to bring it back anyway. That kind of choice deserves acknowledgement. I called the shelter on Moorfield. I explained the situation without going into unnecessary detail. They wouldn't confirm whether Gerald was a resident, privacy rules, but the man I spoke with said he could pass along a message. 3 days later, Gerald called me. We talked for about an hour. He was a former electrician from Columbus, had worked commercial construction for 22 years before the injury. Smart, measured, a little suspicious of me at first, which was fair. I told him I appreciated what he'd done. I told him I had a proposition. I know a few people. You don't spend 31 years in county engineering without building a network. I made some calls. Gerald had his contractor's license just lapsed. Within 2 weeks, I'd connected him with a project manager I'd worked with for a decade who was looking for experienced electrical subcontractors. The work was steady, the pay was fair, and it came with the kind of reliability that lets you sign a lease. I didn't give Gerald money. He hadn't wanted my money, and I respected that. I gave him something he could use. He called me 6 weeks later to tell me he'd moved into an apartment. He sounded the way my son had sounded when he got his promotion. That specific, quiet happiness. I told him I was glad. The thing about Courtney is that she never apologized. In the weeks after the dinner, Daniel came by twice. He was attentive, brought food the second time, asked how I was doing in the way you ask, when you know you owe someone something and you're not quite ready to say it directly. I was kind to him. I didn't withhold myself. But I also didn't pretend we were in the same place we'd been before. Courtney sent me a text about 10 days after the incident. It said, "Hope we can all move past this. Life's too short for awkwardness. Hugs." I read it once. I didn't respond. That's not cruelty. That's just accuracy. There was nothing in that message that acknowledged what had happened or what she'd said. It was a message designed to close a chapter without having to write the ending honestly. I had spent 63 years learning to tell the difference between an apology and a management strategy. That was a management strategy. I didn't bring it up with Daniel. If he wanted to discuss Courtney's behavior, I was open to that conversation. I wasn't going to force it on him. He had to get there himself the way adults have to get to things themselves. About 2 months later, he did. We were at my house on a Sunday, and I'd made the kind of dinner that takes most of the afternoon. A pot roast, the recipe Margaret had written out on an index card that I keep tucked inside the cabinet door. We'd eaten and were sitting with coffee, and Daniel was quiet in the way that means he's been working something up to say. He said, "I think I'd been making excuses for her for a while." I waited. He said, "Not just with you, with other people, with her own family. I keep filling in the explanations for why she does things, like I'm her press secretary." I nodded. He said, "I don't know what to do about it." I said, "I don't think you're asking me what to do. I think you're telling me you've seen it." He thought about that. Yeah, that's probably right. We didn't say much more about it that night. I didn't need to. He was seeing it. That was enough for now. I'm not writing this because I want sympathy. I'm not writing it because I want to make Courtney into a villain or my son into a victim. People are complicated. Marriages are complicated. I know that better than most. I'm writing it because of something Margaret told me in the hospital, near the end. When I was sitting with her during one of the nights she couldn't sleep, she was talking about regrets. Not hers, but in general. And she said something I've never forgotten. She said the thing people most often regret is not saying no early enough. Not to big things, she said. To the small, quiet dismissals that you let pass because you don't want to make trouble. The ones that stack up. You have to let them know, she said. Not loudly, not cruelly, but they have to know. I let my daughter-in-law know. Not with a speech, not with a confrontation. With an empty chair at her table and an envelope she handed to a stranger she underestimated. She knows now. The check is still made out to Daniel. He's going to do something good with it. I trust him with that. I trust him with most things, and I expect to keep trusting him more as he finds his way through this. Gerald is working, good at his job. We talk every few weeks. He called me on my birthday in October, which surprised me. He said, "I just wanted to check on you, Walter. You did right by me, and I don't forget that." I told him I didn't do anything he hadn't already earned by doing right himself. He laughed. He said, "You sound like someone who's been alone a long time." I told him my wife died 14 years ago and that I still set a cup of coffee on her side of the kitchen table some mornings without thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She raised a good one in your son." I said, "She did. We both did." That was the best conversation I'd had in months. I am 63 years old. I have patience built from loss and from long years and from the particular endurance you develop when you love someone through dying and keep showing up to your own life afterward. I don't need noise. I don't need the last word. I just need people to understand that silence is not the same as absence, and still water runs in all directions.